October 25th, 1415. A muddy field in northern France stretches between two armies, and the morning mist carries the weight of 20,000 French knights in full plate armor. They face 6,000 Englishmen, most of them sick, all of them exhausted from a march that has stripped them to bone and sinew. The rain that began 3 days ago has turned the plowed earth into a slick, clinging trap. But this is not the story of how superior numbers crushed a weaker force. This is the story of how terrain and weather became weapons, and how the flower of French chivalry drowned in their own armor. To understand how 6,000 starving soldiers destroyed an empire's pride, you need to know that the French had never lost a battle like this. The Constable of France commanded the greatest heavy cavalry in Europe. These were men whose grandfathers had ridden with Du Guesclin, whose fathers had broken English lines from Patay to Formigny. They wore steel worth a village, rode horses bred for war, and followed banners that had never bent to English cloth. They were about to charge across a field that would swallow them whole. Henry V, King of England, had marched his army to this moment through 2 months of siege, disease, and a desperate sprint toward the port of Calais. Now, with his back to the sea and winter closing in, he watched 30,000 Frenchmen form their battle lines and prepare to end his war in a single crushing blow. The numbers tell a legend, but the legend walks on blistered feet. Chronicles claim 30,000 French faced 6,000 English, but the mud-stained reality cuts those figures down to size. Modern estimates place the French at 12 to 15,000, the English closer to 9,000, with perhaps 6,000 fit to fight. Still impossible odds, but odds measured in flesh and blood, not fairy tale. Henry had landed at Harfleur in August with the largest English army to cross the Channel in a generation. The siege took 5 weeks and cost him 3,000 men, not to steal, but to dysentery, and the bloody flux that turned soldiers into corpses faster than any sword. His planned march to Paris became a desperate dash to Calais, carrying the sick, burning supplies, living off what they could forage from a countryside that offered nothing but mud and empty granaries. The French had time to choose their ground. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, commanded not just numbers but the accumulated weight of feudal obligation. Every duke, count, and ambitious knight in northern France had answered the call. These were not peasant levies or hired swords. They were the men-at-arms who had learned war at Poitiers and sworn never to repeat their grandfathers' mistakes. Yet they were about to make new ones. The English longbow had been killing French knights for 70 years since Crécy proved that a cloth-yard shaft could punch through the finest armor. But the French had adapted. Their new tactics called for dismounted men-at-arms, supported by crossbowmen, advancing behind pavises to close with the archers before the arrows could do their work. People call what happened next a miracle. The truth is written in weather reports and soil surveys. This was not divine intervention. This was what happens when confidence meets clay, and 30 years of tactical evolution collides with a plowed field after 3 days of rain. The stage was set, the players had taken their marks, and somewhere in the muddy space between the armies, the laws of physics were preparing to write the bloodiest lesson in medieval warfare. The French deployed with the confidence of men who had never lost a battle they planned to fight. Marshal Boucicaut anchored the right wing. The Duke of Alençon commanded the left, and between them stretched a line of steel that had cost more to equip than most kingdoms earned in a year. 3 battles deep they formed, dismounted men-at-arms in front, mounted knights behind, crossbowmen filling the gaps like mortar between stones. They chose their ground with care. The field between the villages of Tramecourt and Agincourt narrowed to barely 1,000 yards, wide enough for their formations but too narrow for the English to refuse the fight. Woods pressed close on both flanks, funneling any engagement into a frontal collision where French numbers would crush English desperation in a single grinding push. Henry had no choice but to accept the trap. His men formed a thin line anchored on those same woods, men-at-arms in the center, longbowmen on the wings, and behind hastily driven stakes. 6,000 men stretched to fill a space meant for twice that number, their ranks so shallow that every arrow, every sword thrust, every stumble would matter. The French could see the gaps. They could count the banners, measure the line, and calculate the mathematics of destruction. Why should they worry about archers when their crossbowmen could duel at distance, and their cavalry could ride down any longbowman who stood to draw his bow? But the French had made their plans in dry weather on solid ground against an enemy who would fight according to the rules of civilized warfare. The rain had been falling for 3 days, and the rules were about to wash away with the topsoil. What the French saw was a narrow field perfect for concentrated attack. What they could not see was how that same field would trap their own weight against them, or how the autumn plowing would turn their advantage into a grave 6 inches deep. They prepared to charge across 1,000 yards of open ground, and somewhere in that distance, physics and fate were sharpening their knives. The French spent the night like lords at a tournament, their pavilions glowing with lamplight and warming with braziers that turned canvas walls into theaters of shadow and gold. They diced for prisoners not yet taken, wagered on which banner would reach the English line first, and composed ransoms for a king they planned to cage before sunset. Wine flowed, and why not? Tomorrow would be work, but tonight the celebration was deferred by mere hours. The English huddled in whatever shelter they could scrape from the muddy earth. No fires by the king's order, and precious little food. They had been living on nuts and berries for days, their supply train abandoned in the race for Calais, their stomachs tight with hunger and fear. Henry walked among them through the darkness, his voice carrying words of comfort that rang hollow against the sound of French laughter drifting across the field. Then the weather turned. Rain that had been falling in fits and starts since Tuesday began to pour in earnest, drumming against armor and soaking through wool that was already damp with sweat and fear. The French cursed and retreated deeper into their tents. The English had nowhere to go but deeper into the mud. By dawn, the field between the armies had transformed. What had been stubble and dirt the day before became a slick of clay that clung to everything it touched. Horses struggled to find footing where yesterday they had pranced. Men sank ankle deep in what had been solid ground, their steel sabatons collecting pounds of mud with every step. The French looked across that field and saw inconvenience. A little mud, a little slipping, nothing that weight and will could not overcome. They had faced worse ground at Rosebecque and carried the day. Their grandfathers had fought at Bouvines in a downpour and crushed the Holy Roman Emperor. Rain was weather, not war, and war was their profession. But the English archers looked at that same field and saw something else. They saw ground that would slow a charge, Myra formation, trap the very weight that made French knights invincible. They began to smile. Dawn broke gray and wet, revealing a field transformed. The plowed furrows that had been hard earth on Tuesday now glistened with standing water, and the spaces between had turned to sucking clay that grabbed at boots and would not let go. Mist rose from the churned ground like smoke from a funeral pyre, and through it, 2 armies took their final shapes. The French advanced their line to within bowshot, a wall of steel and silk that stretched from wood to wood. 3,000 dismounted men-at-arms formed the front rank, their surcoats bright with heraldry that read like a roll call of European nobility. Behind them, mounted knights sat their destriers in perfect formation, lances vertical, banners streaming in the wet wind. Crossbowmen filled the gaps, their pavises planted like tombstones in the mud. Henry deployed his men with the precision of a general who had no room for error. His men-at-arms, perhaps 900 strong, held the center in a wedge formation designed to punch through or die trying. On the wings, 5,000 longbowmen hammered stakes into the soft earth, their bodkin points glinting like steel thorns in the morning light. Each man carried a sheaf of 24 arrows, and each arrow had been fletched to kill at 200 paces. The field itself had become a weapon. Barely 800 yards separated the armies, but those yards had been cut and churned by autumn plowing, then saturated by 3 days of rain. What had been farmland was now a killing ground, designed by accident and armed by weather. The French could see their enemy clearly now. Thin lines of men who looked more like scarecrows than soldiers, their gambesons stained with mud and march, their faces hollow with hunger and fear. 6,000 ragged Englishmen against the flower of French chivalry, and the outcome seemed as certain as sunrise. But sunrise had come gray and wet, and in the space between the armies, the ground itself was choosing sides. For 4 hours, the armies stared at each other across the muddy field, neither willing to make the first move. The French waited for the English to advance into the trap they had prepared. The English waited for the French to advance into the trap the weather had prepared. The morning stretched taut as a bowstring, and then Henry made the choice that would write his name in history. The English line stepped forward. Not a charge, not a march, but a careful advance that carried them just within extreme bow range. 5,000 longbowmen drew their weapons in a single fluid motion that turned the gray morning white with goose feathers and bright with steel points. The first volley rose like a flock of murderous birds, arcing high against the clouded sky before diving toward the French front ranks. Bodkin points struck plate armor with the sound of hail on stone, most deflecting harmlessly, but some finding gaps at the joints, some punching through where the steel had been worked thin. Men stumbled, cursed, bled, but the line held firm. The French crossbowmen answered with their own volleys, but their heavy weapons fired slowly, and their range fell short of the English position. Worst of all, their pavises had been planted in mud that would not hold them steady. The protective shields tilted and slipped with every shot, turning cover into hazard. Then the French heavy cavalry spurred forward, not in the careful advance their commanders had planned, but in a thundering charge designed to ride down the archers before the arrows could do their killing work. 2,000 mounted knights drove their destriers toward the English wings, their lances leveled, their war cries echoing across the field like the roar of an approaching storm. But the ground beneath their horses' hooves was no longer solid earth. It was clay and standing water, furrow and mire, and with every stride the charge began to lose its shape. Horses stumbled, riders fought for balance, and the perfect wedge of destruction became a struggling mass of steel and horseflesh fighting the field itself. The English archers drew again, and this time their targets were not distant figures in steel, but struggling men and animals trapped in their own momentum. The second volley flew straight and level, and where it struck, the morning turned red. The cavalry charge that should have ended the battle in minutes instead became a slow-motion disaster written in physics and clay. Destriers bred for war found themselves floundering in mud that rose past their fetlocks, then their hocks, then higher still. Riders in full-plate armor watched their mounts struggle against ground that pulled like quicksand at every step. The first ranks of knights reached the English stakes moving no faster than a walking pace, their horses exhausted by the fight with the field itself. The sharpened points, angled forward and braced against the charge, did their work with mechanical precision. Horses impaled themselves on the wooden spears, their riders catapulted forward into the mud or crushed beneath tons of dying horseflesh. Behind them, the following ranks piled up in a crushing mass of confusion. Knights who had trained their entire lives for the moment of contact found themselves trapped in a press of bodies, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but die as English arrows found the gaps in their armor and English billhooks dragged them from their saddles. The dismounted men-at-arms fared no better. Their advance across the plowed field became a nightmare of exhaustion and exposure. Each step in the clinging mud required the effort of 3 on solid ground. Men who had marched to battle in perfect formation arrived at the English lines strung out in ragged groups, breathless, mud-soaked, and vulnerable to weapons they should have swept aside with ease. The narrow field that had been chosen to concentrate French power now worked against them. Pressed between the woods, unable to deploy their numbers, they could only crowd forward into the grinding machine that the English line had become. Knightsworth kingdoms died under billhook and warhammer, wielded by men whose names would never grace a chronicle. This was not the clean death of the tournament ground or the glorious charge of the chanson. This was mud and blood and the sound of steel crumpling under blunt force trauma. The flower of French chivalry was being ground to paste by physics, weather, and English pragmatism. The trap had sprung, and 30 years of tactical evolution was drowning in 6 inches of Norman clay. When the French line finally reached the English position, the battle transformed from archery duel to butcher's work. English men-at-arms met the surviving knights with weapons designed not for glory but for killing armored men efficiently. Warhammers caved in steel helms, billhooks dragged riders from their feet, and falchions hacked at joints where plate armor offered no protection. The English fought with the desperation of men who knew they would never reach Calais if they lost here. But desperation had sharpened into something harder than steel. These were veterans of siege work and forced marches, men who had learned that survival mattered more than honor, that winning ugly was still winning. French knights found themselves fighting not a battle but a brawl. In the narrow confines between the woods, their superior training meant nothing when they could barely swing their swords. Exhausted by the advance through the mud, weighed down by armor that had become a burden rather than protection, they struggled against enemies who moved faster, struck harder, and cared nothing for the rules of chivalrous combat. The longbowmen had not stopped shooting. From the flanks, they poured arrows into the melee at point-blank range, bodkin points punching through the backs and sides of French armor, while the knights fought for their lives against the English front line. There was no honor in it, no single combat, no chance for ransom or quarter. Then the English reserves joined the fight, and what had been a melee became a massacre. Welshmen with long knives swarmed over fallen knights, cutting throats through helmet visors, stabbing up under arm guards where the steel was weakest. They took a few prisoners and asked for no quarter in return. By noon, the field was carpeted with French dead and dying. Those knights who could still move struggled to retreat through mud, now slick with blood. Their retreat harassed by English archers who shot them down like wounded deer. The greatest heavy cavalry in Europe had been destroyed not by superior tactics but by terrain, weather, and the simple fact that physics cares nothing for noble blood or ancient privilege. This was not fighting for victory. This was fighting for survival, and the English had remembered how to survive. By midday, the impossible had happened. The English held the field, and scattered across the mud lay the highest nobility of France. Dukes, counts, and banneret knights who had never bent the knee to any man now knelt in the mire, their ransoms worth more than Henry's entire kingdom. The Duke of Alençon, the Count of Eu, Marshal Boucicaut himself, all waited among hundreds of lesser nobles for the negotiation that would restore them to freedom and bankrupt England in the process. But Henry faced a problem no English king had confronted since Poitiers. He held more prisoners than he had soldiers to guard them. Nearly 2,000 French nobles sat in the mud under loose supervision, their weapons surrendered but their numbers overwhelming. Each captive knight was worth a fortune, but together they represented a force that could retake the field if the battle turned again. Then the scouts brought words that chilled English blood. A fresh French force approached from the south, perhaps 3,000 men under the Counts of Marle and Fauconbergs. The second phase of the French battle plan was unfolding, and Henry's exhausted army would have to fight again with prisoners at their backs and enemies at their front. The king faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Honor and profit demanded that prisoners be held for ransom according to the laws of war. Military necessity demanded something harsher. If the French attacked while 2,000 enemy nobles sat behind English lines, the victory would become a slaughter with the English as victims. Henry gave the order that chronicles would debate for centuries. Kill the prisoners, except for those of the highest rank whose ransoms were too valuable to sacrifice. The command went against every tradition of medieval warfare, every code of chivalric conduct, every expectation of honorable victory. But Henry was not fighting for honor. He was fighting to get his army home alive, and dead prisoners could not rise to stab his men in the back when the next French charge came thundering across the field. The killing began with reluctance and ended with the mechanical efficiency of men who had learned that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. The second French attack never came. The Counts of Marle and Fauconbergs took one look at the field, carpeted with their countrymen's bodies, and melted it back into the countryside like mist before sunrise. The English held Agincourt, but victory had arrived limping, and the price walked beside it wearing French colors. The numbers tell the story in stark mathematics. French dead numbered in the thousands, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 10,000 when disease and wounds finished what arrows and blades had started. The English lost perhaps 25 men, a disparity so lopsided that chroniclers would spend centuries trying to explain how physics had rewritten the laws of medieval combat. Among the French dead lay names that read like a roll call of European nobility: the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, the Count of Nevers, 300 knights banneret, and 1,500 men-at-arms whose ransoms could have bought entire counties. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a single morning, their blood mixing with Norman clay that would be fertile for generations. But the English victory was hollow at its core. Henry had won a battle, not a war. His army was still trapped in enemy territory, still outnumbered by French forces gathering in every direction, still racing winter and disease to the port of Calais. Agincourt had bought him passage, not peace, and the road home stretched long and dangerous through a countryside that would remember this morning for centuries. The longbow had proven its point with brutal efficiency. Steel armor, noble blood, and chivalric tradition meant nothing against physics, weather, and English pragmatism. Medieval warfare had been revolutionized in the space of 6 hours, and the revolution was written in French casualties that littered the field like broken toys. This had not ended French power, but it had ended the idea that French power was invincible. One muddy field in northern France had rewritten the mathematics of medieval combat and left the survivors to count the cost in blood, gold, and shattered assumptions about the nature of war itself. Henry had crushed 30,000 Frenchmen with 6,000 Englishmen, and the miracle was written in rain, mud, and the sound of arrows finding their mark. The bells that rang in London when news of Agincourt arrived would echo through 5 centuries of English memory. St. Crispin's Day became a festival of impossible victory, celebrated in taverns and told in stories that grew with each telling until myth swallowed fact and legend became more real than history. But the real legacy of Agincourt was written in steel and gunpowder, not parchment and poetry. The battle marked the end of an age when heavy cavalry ruled the battlefield and noble blood guaranteed victory. The longbow had proven that common men with simple weapons could destroy the greatest warriors in Christendom, and that lesson would not be forgotten by kings who counted the cost of maintaining knights in an age when arrows flew cheaper than honor. Within a generation, cannon would replace catapults, and within a century, firearms would make both longbow and lance obsolete. The medieval world died at Agincourt, killed by physics and buried in French mud. What rose from its grave was something harder, more practical, more willing to trade honor for effectiveness and tradition for victory. The French rebuilt their army around professional soldiers and artillery, abandoning the feudal levies that had failed so catastrophically in the Norman clay. The English clung to their longbows for another century, but the weapon that had won Agincourt became a relic, outranged by muskets and outclassed by cannon that could breach any wall or break any formation. Yet every year on October 25th, the bells still ring in parish churches across England, and the faithful remember St. Crispin and St. Crispinian, patron saints of shoemakers who became the patron saints of impossible odds. The prayer is simple, the memory enduring, and somewhere in the sound of bronze on bronze, the ghosts of 6,000 muddy Englishmen whisper their thanks to the rain that saved them, and the field that swallowed their enemies. Agincourt became legend, but the legend remembers this truth above all others: that victory belongs not to the brave or the noble, but to those who understand that wars are won by men who refuse to lose, no matter how long the odds or deep the mud.